But I wanted to start. We've got a small group here today, and I think that's quite a nice thing to do, because actually we can have some quite intimate conversations about this. Everything's obviously confidential. We don't even name in names and schools and things like that. I'm really interested in what you feel your biggest challenge is currently as a leader of literacy. And it might be around, students' literacy levels and staff and their competency. It might be you and how you feel. You might be new to the role, but I'm really interested to know what our starting point is. So if you can have a think about that now, and then put what your biggest challenge in the chat, that'd be really helpful. Thank you. Okay, so when you're ready, if you can. Thank you, that's fantastic. Let's see what we've got. Brilliant. Yeah, okay, Beth, thank you for that. Yeah, getting subject areas to own a responsibility for supporting. And it's like everybody's business. Yeah, I think there's two levels to that, isn't it? One is that kind of communicates that moral imperative and them saying that they're on board with literacy drives, but actually getting them to do that day in, day out is a real challenge. Absolutely. Thanks, Chelsea. Interventions and timetabling them is an absolute nightmare. Absolute, yeah, good. Yeah, and that's a reality, I think, Catherine. I think when you go from school to school, there can be completely different approaches to literacy leadership. When I started off teaching, my first kind of TLR role, it was called an honorarium back then, but that literacy leadership role was seen as a role for novice teachers who wanted to get onto that first ladder, ring of the ladder. And actually, if you were to read some of the DfE kind of guidance that came out quite recently around struggling readers and supporting readers in secondary, they're finally getting that message across that actually it needs to come from top down, and you need somebody on that senior leadership team that's really strategically leading on this across the school. Thank you very much for that, for your honesty as well. I think we are all going to be sharing these same challenges, myself included. Mine's just on a slightly bigger scale because I've got different schools that I'm kind of grappling with these challenges. So one of the things I think about this is the disconnect. I, on a personal day-to-day basis, find that there are so many priorities happening in schools, even within trusts and individual schools having slightly different priorities, that literacy can often feel like it's disconnected from those main priorities. And I like this analogy of a jigsaw because very often I feel like all these bits of the jigsaw, whether you're looking at behaviour and routines or metacognition or feedback or assessment and that sort of thing, I often feel like literacy is like the jigsaw piece that's put in like around the edges, and I just wish that people had put it in first. That's the first piece of the jigsaw, and everything else kind of develops around it. And I think, whenever you read about a teaching model in a school, you very rarely see explicit references to reading, writing and numeracy. There's some brilliant teaching and learning models out there. We use Great Teacher Toolkit as a kind of overarching principles, but nowhere does it talk explicitly about literacy. It's always the add-on. And I think because of that, as leaders, we're then left to our own devices to kind of muddle our way through this, to compete against these other priorities. And yet literacy really should be that central piece of the jigsaw. So it's about how can we manage other people around us in school, whether we are managing a team or we're managing upwards to senior leadership, how can we bring them on board, and see it as central? So if we're focusing on supporting sending mainstream, well, we've got to think of that through a literacy lens and so on. Now, sorry, I won't go back on that one. I think one of the other things that is a key challenge is, I think, if you talk to other literacy leaders and people in school, they'll say things like, oh, well, policy's always changing, and whichever government we've got, they've all got different priorities, which to a certain extent is obviously true. But for the last 100 years, educationalists and researchers have been repeating the same messages. And I think this is important to share with those who make those big decisions in schools, because even like from 1922, educationalist George Sampson was talking about this idea that every teacher is a teacher of English because every teacher is a teacher in English and through that language. And then we had the Bullitt Report in the 1970s talking about, again, language across the curriculum. We had updates to the national curriculum and so on, updates to the Ofsted Inspection Handbook. All of these people have been emphasising for years that literacy is the responsibility of everybody. And of course, it requires individuals like ourselves to lead that and at a strategic level. But disciplinary literacy, and I know this is a big buzzword at the minute, but it's really important. It's the key to unlocking learning across our curriculum in school. And that's why literacy needs to be placed at the heart of our teaching and learning policies. And if they're still not convinced, you can show them over time all of these Ofsted reports that have come out over the years. I mean, some of the, if you've been in education for a while, will remember some of these reports, from removing barriers to literacy. Then the year after, we had moving English forward. Then we had a shared responsibility the year after. Somebody was busy over those 3 years, I think. But the common kind of thread through these is the message that it is the responsibility of everybody. And if you want to support students to be successful in other subjects, you've got to support them in terms of accessing that curriculum. And I particularly like that quote in the middle from the Moving English report, because it talks about, if we're only saying that it's the English teacher's job to develop reading and writing, how many hours of that a week is that really? 4 or 5 hours maximum. So if that is not replicated everywhere else, those efforts are lost, aren't they? So, you've got lots of ammunition there to go back to people to try to kind of raise that profile, to elevate that status. And I mentioned this earlier on. So the DfE last year brought out this new report. It was a kind of a research review about reading in the secondary school. It was very much needed, and I think it's a very sensible report. So HMI inspectors basically reported in this that when they went into schools, secondary schools in particular, they rarely saw leaders developing a coordinated strategy for struggling readers. Now, I'm going to talk about reading. Obviously, I know there's other aspects of literacy, but that's going to be the thread through today. And what they were saying was, there were pockets of good practice, but it wasn't joined up. There wasn't a sense of coherence. So they were saying, it's really important that we've got this coordinated strategy so that people can access the curriculum. And they saw English departments identifying the weakest readers. They had their own strategy, but maybe they weren't then talking to the SENCO and the team who support students with special educational needs. There was no kind of synergy there, okay? And they also summed up how, without a carefully thought out and implemented strategy behind these approaches, what some secondary schools are doing becomes tokenistic and implemented at a real surface level. Now, anybody that's done anything around school improvement and implementation, you'll be aware of the EEF resources around this, which are excellent. There's a little short course you can do on their website. But planning for implementation is really important. And whether you're implementing literacy approaches or approaches to enumeracy, whatever, implementation has to be done really thoughtfully. It happens in stages. It unfolds over an extended period of time. And it's this idea that when we're introducing new approaches and ideas, it can't just be this single event that takes place when we're adopting them or on the day that the training happens. It's about a process that starts way before we actually introduce something to staff and students and lasts for a long time afterwards. So it's focusing on what to implement, but also how to do that. And I think this is one of the reasons why many attempts to improve literacy over the years has probably not been as successful, because those who are leading or supporting the leadership of this haven't really considered some of these bigger picture ideas. So it's about investing. And we know from that report, that DFE report, that there are some key kind of features and characteristics of schools who are getting it right. So they talked about senior leaders prioritising reading and literacy. They talked about schools having really clear, robust systems for diagnostic assessment, but tracking of impact. They talked about schools matching pupils' individual needs to actual interventions that match those. So it's not just kind of like a pick and mix, or we'll put them on this one or this one. It's actually focused on what they need most. And they also talked about how the people that were supporting the students in most need were experts, whether that's teachers or teaching assistants, that they were well trained. And that obviously leads into, well, what do we do for training for whole staff? How do we support them with this idea of disciplinary literacy? So there were lots and lots of features there. And I think we could all probably say that we are strong in some of these areas, but there'll be areas that we need to tighten up on. But this gives us kind of an overview there. But I think if we think about the individual barriers for us, I think there are some key barriers here. Obviously, the first one is who's responsible for literacy, and is that well understood across our schools? But then we're very lucky that we've got a huge evidence base for literacy. We can go to the EEF, and there are lots of other researchers who are really credible that we can go to. But there's so much of it, and sometimes that's really hard to sift through. The EEF is a great place to start, but then, it can be a bit of a, go down the rabbit hole. You start to unpick one thing, it leads you to something else. So sometimes it might feel like there's too much evidence, okay? And very often, this is a reality, that we have a lack of time. If you have a TLR and you are not on the senior leadership team, you will have a very specific and probably very limited amount of time. And that is a real challenge. And sometimes when we're delivering on improvements to literacy, I think another barrier is the focus can be too generic. And this obviously links in with this idea of literacy in the disciplines and so on. There's that idea that there's too little focus on what it is our pupils in our school need the most. It's really easy to go to the EF and go to all the recommendations and say, yeah, we're going to pick that one and cherry pick them. But how do we know that is what our pupils need is the big question. And it's about making fewer but more strategic choices. So I think, that's a reality. I think things are starting to change a little bit, but I still think there's this kind of disparity across schools, which is a real challenge. And my colleague, and you'll have all heard of him, Alex Quigley, he talks about this idea that improving literacy really takes the whole village, and that there's no kind of magic wand, there's no quick solution to fixing literacy. But if everybody comes together and works together and understands their role in this, then we've got a better chance of improving outcomes. Okay. So we've got problems, we've got challenges, and we obviously need to think about solutions. And I think the first thing we need to think about is what does our whole school approach look like? What does the culture look like in our school? I think sometimes schools' views of literacy literacy intervention are kind of too heavily focused on what programs can we use for intervention rather than making improvements to classroom pedagogy. So we need to think, does our school really have what's called this tiered strategy? Anybody that's linked to writing your school's pupil premium strategy will be familiar with the EF's tiered approach. So it's this idea that, half of your efforts and money should be spent around improving the quality of teaching, okay? And then you've got like a quarter on targeted academic support, i.e. interventions, and then you've got a quarter on wider strategies. Now, that's the model for how we spend the pupil premium, but that model can easily be used when we're thinking about literacy. What are we doing to improve the experience of all our students in the classroom? What are we doing in terms of interventions for a minority? And then what are we doing to enrich that experience for everybody? If you're not involved in writing your school's pupil premium strategy, or you've never heard about it before, go back to school and ask about it, because it should be done as a team effort. And whoever's writing it should be having conversations with you about how we're spending the pupil premium to support literacy. Okay, some schools are doing this really well. Some schools need to brush up on that, but you can go back and ask the questions. Okay, so it's about shifting culture, but then it's about, are we being driven by assessment in our school rather than assumption? So I think it's safe to say the majority of schools now measure reading in some form. Some might use the big organisations with big standardisation samples up and down the country. Some might use some freebies online. That's fine. The most important thing is, what do we do with that? But I think from a teacher's point of view, if we're sharing reading age information with them and we see a low reading age of 8 for a student in year 9, it's really, really tempting just to look at that number and to think about the symptoms and to focus on the barriers. And what we have to do as leaders of literacy is to support teachers to understand why they have a reading age that low, okay? And very often it can be linked back to those root causes around early reading. So this is based on the Simple View of Reading. It's a model from the EF's Key Stage 2 guidance report. And it's really useful. If you haven't looked at the Key Stage 2 report, I really would look at it, because if we are trying to tackle this challenge of students coming to secondary and not having got to the standard we need them to yet, we've got to backtrack and got to think, how do we scaffold them up? But this, you might have a reading age of 8, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you have weaknesses with your word reading or decoding. So how do we know that? We've got to use assessment really diagnostically. Sometimes we might use it as a screener for everybody, but then we've got to think, is that specific enough for those who we know are struggling? And if it's not, how can we shrink that problem by using better assessment? And I use the York assessment, the York assessment of reading comprehension. It's one-to-one. You use it with a fewer amount of students, but it really breaks it up into word reading, fluency, comprehension. And then I can make a decision about which intervention I'm going to match those students up with, because there's no point putting them on a phonics intervention if it's actually some vocabulary comprehension that they need a bit more support with. So it's about being assessment driven. And I'm not going to spend a long time explaining to, well, unless you want to interrupt me and ask me if you're not quite sure. But when we're talking about reading ages, on the surface, that seems quite a reasonable thing to do in schools, doesn't it? It's tangible. We think, okay, got a reading age of 11 or 12. Yeah, we can understand that. But I think there's often a lack of understanding of how that reading age has actually come about. So almost kind of educating staff how those tests work are really important. So for example, here, if I'm a 14-year-old and I've sat a reading age assessment, I've got a raw score of 84, which puts me in the bottom 10% of my year group, my age group. I then get a reading age for the process of tracing back what age group got the same score as their average. So you can see here, if I got 84, I'm tracking it back to whoever got the average score, and then I'm tracking back down to the chronological age. And that means I've got an age of 10, a reading age of 10. Reading ages are based on average performance, not expected. There isn't a standard that we're saying you've got to do X, Y, and Z to have a reading age of 10, 11, 12. It's based upon a national cohort. And this is why sometimes we need to err on the side of caution, because dependent upon what your national picture looks like, that can skew. but it's useful. So it's one bit of information that's useful. And if it's used alongside the more standardised age, so the standard age score, the stay nines, we can get a bit of a better picture as to how our pupils are performing in comparison to national cohorts. Because often they're based on this idea of a bell curve like we have at GCSE. Okay, so if you are in a school that's measuring reading, using reading ages, whatever test you're using, think about how often are you doing this? If you're doing it more than twice a year, you're doing it too much. Okay, my schools this year, we've gone year 7, we're going to do it twice, September, and then spring 2. And then after that, we do it once a year. Because realistically, what's the point? What is the point of weighing that pig if you are not doing lots of things in between to actually give them a chance to catch up? So be really careful. Make sure you talk to the people who are running these tests about what are the benefits of the tests and what are the limitations. There are obviously, they can be really helpful, but we don't want to put too much emphasis on them because they're a really complex measure. Okay, Dr. Jessie Ricketts is a good one to look up with in this area. She's written some really good articles online for the TES about this and why we should be so cautious. Okay, right, at this point I just want to pause and I just want to know how many people have we got actually. Let's have a look. So we've got 6. Does 6 include us, Beth, do you think?
Yeah.
Okay, right. So
Chelsea, Catherine and Kenny who are here.
Yeah, rather than doing breakouts, let's do just an open discussion here. I'm really interested in how your school currently measures progress in reading and what do you do with that information? So whether it's Catherine or Chelsea or Kenny, does one of you want to just kickstart that conversation? If you're still there.
I'm still here, it's Catherine.
Hi.
Hi. We started off doing RAT testing across Key Stage 3. And we've now just taken on and also done NGRT for Year 7. In some circumstances, the measurements have come out slightly differently. So the RAT testing may show they've got a reading age of maybe 11, 12, whereas NGRT is identifying that it might be around about 9. So I think, as you've just said, it's good to get both and to monitor where it's going. Yeah. What have I done with this information? We have identified key students that require some additional support in order to bring their reading age and their comprehension up. We are running a book club twice a week for 2 different groups where they are listening to a story being read to them, so that they're getting that inference of in the inflection of voice so that they're reading more fluently. We've identified, I have the key Year 7s who are the weakest in my English class. I've been implementing quite a few of the ideas from this course anyway, as to how we can improve that knowledge and that ability. We've also started them on Sparks Reader. So we've done that assessment on which text they should be reading, trying to develop that confidence in reading initially, but this is very early doors.
Yeah. I mean,
that's my contribution.
Yeah, that sounds like you've got cracking with quite a few different approaches there as part of your strategy. I think the first point that you made about using the word reading test, the RAT test, and then using NGRT, I had the same issue. So we use in our schools Lexonic as one of the interventions, and obviously you have assessment within the programme, and one of those assessments is to do with the RAT. You get a reading age for that one specific area of reading, don't you? And that very often looks different. I've had schools where they've done the STAR reader and accelerated reader and then done NGRT, and they've said it looks nothing like each other. And this is why we really need a really nuanced approach to it. So NGRT works well as a screener, I feel. I think it can throw up weaknesses in either word reading or comprehension. It can flag up whether there might be some students with dyslexic tendencies. obviously to
Yes.
follow up afterwards, which is really useful. But then it's about literally trawling through students and looking at their profiles and making a decision based upon what you can see over time and your professional expertise. And I don't think that's what a lot of schools want to hear. But I have tried this so many times, and it's really hard to just have cut-off points with reading ages and standard age scores, because if you have really kind of black and white boundaries, you end up missing students.
Yes.
So it's a huge process, isn't it? And
Yeah.
quite a stressful one, which is why we don't want to do it more than once, maximum twice in a year, because otherwise we spend more time analysing the data than actually doing something with it. Thank you so much for that, Catherine. And
Not
thank
a
you,
problem.
Chelsea. Yeah, so Chelsea, you're talking about the NGRT, SES score, reading age difference to chronological. Yeah, and it's about using it together, isn't it? I've had schools say, well, we want to tell parents about where they're at, or students. It's really tricky, because I think it takes a lot for leaders and staff to get their head around these scores and this data. It's even trickier to communicate to a wider audience. But that's really interesting. Thank you for sharing that. I think in terms of what we do, obviously, we want to minimise the numbers of students that we require to have that targeted additional support and intervention. We don't want to be taking them out of the curriculum, because as soon as we take them out, they are missing content. There's no way of going about that. You know, we might have some intervention in tutor time, but let's face it, there are some schools, like some of my schools, that where the need is so high, we're having to take them out left, right and centre of other subjects. And that can't be a good thing, but it's about having a balance, isn't it? And what I would say about that is you just got to have confidence in your decisions. As long as you have got a time-limited withdrawal and that you are really robust in monitoring the progress there and making those decisions about whether they stay out for a little bit longer or go back into the lessons, I think that's the most important thing. But we need to reduce those numbers, don't we? So we need to think about, what does our wave one high quality teaching offer look like? This idea that these are approaches and strategies that are going to be helpful to everybody and harmful to none. Okay, but those students who require additionality, they actually are going to be really crucial for them when they're in the classroom as well. They're going to help bridge that classroom learning to intervention learning as well. So I'm just going to put this up there, and at first glance it looks really complicated, and I suppose it is really, because literacy instruction is completely multifaceted and it is complex. And I've shared this with some of my colleagues to really emphasise to them that we are constantly spinning plates in a lesson. And if we are saying that, you know, explicit instruction is important, scaffolding is important, metacognitive strategies, because, you know, if you look at the 5 a day we send from the EF, those are the kind of big approaches. What does that actually mean on a literacy level? You know, we've got the development of oracy and oral language. We've got writing, supporting those who are not yet mastered, but then supporting those that are good writers to write well to learn. And then obviously you've got reading, you know, learning to read for those struggling readers, but then using reading as a vehicle for learning across the curriculum. And within those 3 areas, there's obviously lots of other components. It's no wonder why, over time, developing literacy has been an add-on. You know, even specialist leaders struggle to juggle all of that. And it's not a case of, well, this year we're just going to focus on oracy, or this year we're just going to focus on that. I think the sooner senior leaders realise that we can't have a cherry-picked approach each year, the better. We've got it, on the one hand, we've got to have a less is more approach, but we can't let those plates drop. We've got to keep it going, because we know that there is that reciprocal relationship between these elements of literacy. We've got to be smart, we've got to try to join the dots up, and we've got to be part of the school's teaching and learning team. So if you're not, go back and ask about that. We've got to think about where we can fit the opportunities in for supporting oracy, reading and writing in what we're already trying to achieve in school, okay? And then when we do come to the wave 2 targeted support, it's about, you know, being mindful that if we're going to put more effort into instructional practice in the classroom, we should reduce the need for this. And it is our job to minimise the need. But if we're saying that some students definitely need that additionality, it's how are we using that screening and diagnostic data? Which interventions do we offer? Do we have specialists trained in them? Again, less is more approach. I'll show you what my approach is in a minute. And then it's how do we tier that approach? So I've had lots of conversations with Ofsted recently in all our schools, very practiced in this now, but they want to know, you know, how are you supporting those students who are just below their chronological age, up to 2 years? And then what are you doing for those that they've got further to catch up? So you need a tiered level of approach there. And then you need to have plans in place to show how you're monitoring that. But also, one of the things I don't think schools do very well yet is once a student has finished intervention, how do you then continue to monitor them to make sure that the intervention has worked and it's helped them to catch up, but then they've kept up over a longer period of time? So I think that's a key thing for schools to be thinking about. This is what we do in some of my schools. It's not perfect, but we decided that we didn't want a scattergun approach of interventions. So 4 mainstream high schools have come together and we've decided that we will offer 3 main interventions. So we have Fresh Start for those students who are reading age below 9.5, who require specific help with their word reading. Obviously that programme doesn't only focus on that. We then have Lexonic for those students who can catch up quite quickly, and we know that is minimal in terms of withdrawal from lessons. And then we've got a catch-all Lexia. Some students prefer that kind of online programme, personalised programme for them. So it's about getting a bit of a balance. But there are obviously lots of other programmes out there. I'm not saying these are the only ones you should be using, but this is our doing fewer things better. And what I would say is, you know, we spend a lot of time thinking about our struggling readers. Let's not forget about the readers who are actually quite motivated and engaged and do have a reading age that matches their chronological age. You know, we've got to think about all pupils in that tiered approach. So what are we doing? And those opportunities for regular reading practice, even reading aloud practice for good readers, are really important. Let's not make assumptions about those most able readers. Let's not leave it to chance. They might be good readers, but they might not be reading loads outside of school. So where can we get those opportunities for them within the school day is really important. Right. I want to know now, and again, because we've got a small group, just, you know, please take yourself off mute. What professional development have you either led or you've received in the last 12 months that's linked to literacy? Just really interested to know what schools are focusing on.